The Golden Amazons of Venus by John Murray Reynolds. From Planet Stories, Winter 1939. As found on Project Gutenberg. Read by Julie Hoverson. Golden Amazons of Venus, Part 4. The submarine moved sluggishly ahead, silent except for the hum of its motors. As Jerry looked around, he could see that it was a crudely constructed and makeshift craft. Even so, it was more than he would have expected from men of the apparent mentality of the scaly ones. "This is a funny sort of submarine," he said to Angus. The big engineer, who had twisted around to peer at the bulkhead directly behind them, growled deep in his throat. "It's funnier than you think, lad. Look at this!" McTavish nodded toward one of the sheets of thin steel from which the bulkhead had been built. On the edge there were stamped a few words. The letters were small, and in the dim light Jerry had to narrow his eyes for a moment before he could read them. U.S. Government Steelworks, Atlanta, Georgia. "How in heaven's name did they get that?" Jerry's voice trailed off without finishing the sentence. McTavish shrugged. "You don't need more than one guess. The Stardust must have wrecked somewhere near here, and these devils took some of their parts to build this outlandish craft." At last, long hours later, the submarine came to a stop. As his captors led him up on deck, Jerry saw that the ungainly craft had grounded in the shallows on the shore of a broad river. It was just daylight. A pale yellow filtered down through the canopy of clouds, and a flight of marshfowl was winging by just overhead. "Where are we?" asked Jerry. "This is the Giri River," Closana said. "Savisa lies on the far shore. This is the land of the scaly ones." Some of the reptile men hauled the submarine into a cove and began to cover it over with piles of reeds. Some 20 others formed up in a column with the 3 prisoners in the center. Then the officer in command barked an order and they all moved out along a dirt road that led away from the river. Olga Stark was walking beside the first rank of scaly warriors. She had not looked at the prisoners at all. They tramped steadily onward through the dust in silence, except for the dull slap of the webbed feet of the reptile men and the jingle of their equipment. After a while, the officer in command came back to look at the prisoners. He was a grizzled veteran with shaggy ridges above his eyes and the long-healed scars of half a dozen old wounds on his scaly body. McTavish glared at him for a moment. "Take a good look, sonny boy," the big Scot growled. "What's your name, if you have one?" "I should tear out your tongue for speaking in that tone to an officer of Girivaka," the officer said. His voice had the high-pitched and metallic quality typical of his race, and he bared his pointed teeth in a not unfriendly grin. "But the torturers of the Lord Lanza will take care of you soon enough. I am Toll, commander of a Strika in the border guards." "Where are you taking us?" Toll grinned wickedly. "To the palace of Lanza, overlord of all Venus." Jerry noticed that this countryside of Girivaka was very different from the pleasant and cultivated fields of Savisa, over which he had passed the day before. The roads were dirt and half overgrown. Not much of the country was under cultivation. Strange purple bushes with thorns a foot long covered much of the land, crowding close on the patches of forest where 10-foot ferns towered high overhead. Sometimes they came upon a grazing herd of the yard-long giant ants who would go galloping away with their antennae waving in the air and their hard-shelled leg joints clicking loudly. Depression hung on Jerry Norton's chest like a physical weight. It was not alone the fact that every stride carried them deeper into a grim and hostile land, prisoners whose doom was probably already sealed, that set him biting his lower lip till he tasted the salt blood on his tongue, nor even the fact that Closana shared the same fate because she happened to have been with him at the time of the raid. It was also the utter strangeness of everything. Yesterday in Savisa, the people and the mode of life had been nearly enough to normal so that he was not deeply conscious of the strange vegetation and the other things in which Venus differed from Earth and Mars. Now everything seemed different and alien. The lowering yellow skies of Venus were ominous. The hot winds brought strange smells and seemed to carry a hint of doom. The one thought that gave him any real hope was the fact that Portok the Martian had not been captured with the rest of them. He must have missed them soon after the abduction. There might be a chance that he and Steve Brent would bring the Viking to look for them. They had begun to pass occasional small farms. These were scanty fields carved out of the creeping masses of purple thorns, usually with a roughly thatched hut in the center. On one such occasion, the farmer and his family stood apathetically at the roadside to watch the patrol of reptile men go by. "But they're not scaly," Jerry exclaimed. Clozana shook her head.
"No, they are the green men of Giri. Once they held this land while the scaly ones dwelt in the marshes of Vaka, farther west. But the scaly ones have now been masters of this place for many generations."
The green men, Jerry noticed, looked like ordinary earthlings except for a slight greenish cast to their skin. Probably, like the golden Amazons, they were also descended from the old ones who had come from Mars so long ago. The ragged and mud-stained farmer gave Toll a perfunctory salute, and then leaned on his hoe to watch the column pass by. The warriors of Toll swaggered along the road with the insolent assurance of men who know themselves masters of all around them. The farmer's green face was carefully expressionless, but there was a gleam in his eyes that spoke of no great liking for his scaly masters. When his glance lingered on Jerry's for an instant, the Earthman read a definite sympathy in it. They camped that night in a clearing beside a small stream. One of the guards shot a giant ant with his gas gun, then cracked open the horny shell with his sword. They cut long strips of the meat and roasted it over a fire. Though the taste was peculiar, the stuff was edible, and the 3 prisoners managed to swallow it.
"The condemned man ate a hearty meal,"
Angus McTavish said with grim humor, wiping his fingers on the coarse yellow grass beside him. Olga had gone on with a faster-moving detachment, and only a dozen scaly ones remained with Toll to guard the 3 prisoners. Jerry and Clozana sat side by side before the fire, their bare shoulders touching. The ruddy and flickering glow of the firelight touched Angus's giant frame a little farther around the circle, and then the scaly skins and long snouts of the reptile men watching them. Jerry clasped his arms around his knees. "You know, Angus, at the moment we're living as our ancestors must have lived long generations ago. No ray tubes or Durasteel armor, no portable electrophones, not even a low-speed rocket car to carry us along. It must have been this way back in the days when they built that little old building that's now used for a museum in New York, the Empire State Building."
"You've got your dates mixed, laddie," McTavish yawned. "The Empire State was built in the 20th century, and even the people of those queer old days were more advanced than most of what we've seen of life on this planet of Venus."
"I don't suppose those ancients knew what they were missing."
"Maybe they were better off. At least they only got into trouble on their own Earth instead of wandering off to other planets like a pack of fools as we have."
Toll and 2 of his men came towards them, carrying the ropes with which they had earlier been bound.
"Sorry, but I must tie you up for the night," he said.
For an instant, Jerry thought of making a break. If he could get away, he might find some way of rescuing the others. Then he decided against it. One of the reptile men would be almost sure to bring him down with a gas gun before he got out of the circle of firelight, in spite of the greater strength of his earthly muscles. So he shrugged and allowed the guards to tie him up again. For quite a while he lay awake, hoping to hear the hum of the Viking's motors, but at last he fell asleep. On the 3rd day of their journey, the trail led upward into a range of bleak and rocky hills. A few mean huts were the only signs of human habitation. Then, as they rounded a bend in the trail, which at this point clung to the face of a cliff, they saw the answer to a mystery that had puzzled the civilized world for 2 years. It was the wreck of the spaceship Stardust. She lay at the foot of a cliff across the valley, her steel and duralite hull still gleaming brightly through the thick green creepers that had grown up around it. Even from this distance, Jerry could see the hopelessly crumpled rocket tubes at the stern and the gaping holes where plates had been ripped away to make the submarine that had brought them out of the city of Lar.
So that was the end of the Stardust,
Jerry muttered. I wonder what happened to her crew.
We'll probably find out soon enough,
McTavish replied grimly.
I'll bet all the gold in Savisa against an empty rocket oil tin that we're headed for the same fate right now.
Poor devils. I suppose the scaly ones did them in. I never liked Walter Lansing, as you know, but I could have wished him better luck than this. At last they crossed the hills and saw a broad valley before them. Dim and snow-capped mountains notched the yellow sky on the far side of the valley. A river wound through the plain, and on the shore of the saffron waters of a mighty lake they saw the gray walls of a city. Toll, the reptilian captain, pointed across the valley.
Yonder lies the city of Vakahausen. Soon you will stand before the Lord Lanza, and then, he added with a grim and ghoulish humor, neither I nor anybody else will be bothered with you anymore.
The countryside immediately around the city of the Scaly Ones was better kept and more cultivated than what they had seen of the rest of Girivaka. There were a number of small villages. Then they passed in through the walls, gray stone ramparts that seemed to be very old and were in poor repair. The muzzles of heavy-caliber gas guns peered over the battlements here and there. The crowds in the streets stared curiously as Toll led his prisoners toward the center of the city. Tall reptile men swaggered through the crowds with their swords slung on their hips, but the shorter green men were in the great majority. Most of them, men and women alike, stared at the captives without any particular sign of emotion. This gray and crowded city of Vakahausen had none of the atmosphere of pleasant friendliness that Jerry had noticed in Lar. It seemed a place of fear and oppression. The palace of the ruler of the Scaly Ones was a squat gray building in the center of the city. An arm of the river swept along beneath one wall, with the muddy waters lapping at the aged gray stones. An iron gate swung aside to let the newcomers into the courtyard. Men who wore black metal breastplates over their scales took over the prisoners from Toll, leading them down a long flight of stairs into the dungeons beneath the palace. They waited in a vaulted chamber where the only light was a shaft of yellow radiance that came from a narrow slit high up near the ceiling. "It won't be long now," Jerry muttered. Then a gong sounded somewhere nearby. It was a very resonant and deep-throated gong, and instantly the rock-walled chamber became filled with a green light. It had no visible source, seeming to come from the walls or from the very air itself. Again the gong rolled.
"The Lord Lanza comes!" barked the captain of the guards. "The overlord of Venus is at hand! Down on your knees, captives and slaves!"
Clozana went to her knees, though otherwise holding herself proudly erect with her hands tied behind her back. In the greenish light, her long blonde hair looked like molten gold. Angus McTavish muttered savagely in his beard and stayed on his feet. Instantly, one of the reptile guards drew his sword and held the blade horizontally behind the Scot's knees.
"Kneel, or I cut the tendons,"
he snapped. "Come down, you stiff-necked idiot," Jerry growled. With a muttered oath, Angus dropped to his knees, and the guard stepped back into line. Then the door opened, and 3 men came slowly into the room. 2 were gray-scaled guards who carried their gas guns cocked and ready. The third was a tall man in a loose green robe. His head was hooded, so that nothing of his face could be seen at all. His hands were tucked in the sleeves of his robe. There was something deadly and almost grotesque about that silent figure. Jerry knew that at last he was in the presence of Lanza, lord of the Scaly Ones and ruler of Girivaka, self-styled overlord of all Venus. The seconds passed in silence. The guards were frozen motionless at attention. At last, Lanza spoke, his voice coming hollowly from the shadows of his hood. "Take them to the cells. Their doom shall be decided when the serpent gods have spoken. I have ordered it." The tyrant of Venus gestured sharply, and the guards closed in about the prisoners. for a fleeting instant, Jerry had a glimpse of a thin green hand, a hand where the finger was missing at the second joint. Then Lanza went out, and the door closed behind him. The deeply resonant gong sounded again, and the pulsating green light instantly vanished, so that there was again no light except for the thin trickle of yellow radiance that came in the single high window. The prisoners were pulled to their feet. There was no chance to speak to Angus or Clozana again. Jerry's guards led him down a narrow corridor, past the steel doors of cells. It was very dim and silent. From some of the cells he heard a faint rattle of chains, from others a low groaning. Otherwise there was no sound but their own footfalls. At last the guards opened the door of a cell, pushed Jerry inside, and cut the ropes that bound his arms. As they slammed the heavy steel door behind him, he heard the rasp of bolts. Then the slapping tread of the guards' webbed feet died away, and he was left alone. Dim as the light in the corridor had been, that in the cell was so much less that Jerry had to wait half a minute before he could see it all. Then he made out the outlines of a small bare cell, with a bunk made of a light and flexible metal at one side. There was nothing else in the place. Jerry rubbed his wrists a moment to restore circulation, then sat down on the edge of the bunk and dropped his head in his hands. He seemed to be about at the end of his trail. Well, that was fate. He did not mind so much for himself and Angus. You knew you were taking risks when you signed up for interplanetary travel in the first place. But he was sorry that Clozana had been dragged into it. Jerry had now lost all hope of rescue by the Viking. He did not doubt that her Duralite hull could withstand the explosive bullets of even the heaviest caliber gas guns, nor that her 3-inch ray tubes could blast a way into these underground dungeons in a few minutes. If only Steve Brent knew where to come. That was the rub. There was now no way for Brent to learn where the prisoners were being held, and he could not search all the land of Girivaka. Something small and furtive was moving about on the floor a few feet away. Jerry scuffed his feet on the stones, and the creature scampered quickly away. Probably a rat. It seemed that he was going to have pleasant company during his stay in this place. Restless and gloomy, Jerry stood up again. He started to walk up and down the few feet that the length of his cell allowed him. Then he froze, motionless. A faint tapping was sounding from somewhere to his left. Someone was knocking lightly on the wall of the adjoining cell. Then a voice spoke softly in Martian.
"You there! You in the next cell! Can you hear me?"
Jerry knelt down on the damp floor and put his head close to the base of the wall. Now he could hear the man more clearly, could even hear his heavy breathing. Jerry's groping fingers found a place between two of the stones where the mortar had been picked away to leave a small airspace. "Yes, I hear you," he called softly. He heard a dry chuckle.
"Good. I have been waiting a long time for them to put someone in the next cell. Some of the stones are loose. I will come in."
There was a soft rattle of falling mortar and a scrape of sliding stones. Jerry saw the head and shoulders of a man thrust through the opening, and then the man crawled laboriously into the cell.
"Who are you?" he whispered. "Your accent is not like that of the green men of Giri. Wait, I have a light here."
A small flashlight clicked on. Its beam pointed up into Jerry's face. Then the man gasped.
"Good Lord," he whispered. It's Jerry Norton."
Then the man swung the light so that it swung on himself. Jerry saw a tall, gaunt man in the tattered remains of a blue and silver uniform. It was Major Walter Lansing, once of the interplanetary fleet, who had commanded the ill-fated Stardust when she set out on her voyage into space.
"Norton," he gasped in a hoarse whisper. "Man, I never expected to see anyone from Earth again."
"We thought you were dead."
"I might as well be," Lansing said grimly. "But tell me how you came to be here."
As they squatted there in the darkened cell, Jerry whispered the story of the Vikings' expedition and of his own capture. Lansing told him how the Stardust had been wrecked on the rim of the mountains when landing, and how the scaly ones had captured all the crew.
"They have kept me alive because the signs pointed that way when they cast the omens before the serpent gods," Lansing said. "But all the rest of the crew were used as bait for hunting the giant Dacta. They died. You and your companions will probably meet the same fate.
Pleasant prospect, Jerry said grimly. Lansing gripped his arm.
There's a chance, Norden. Listen, I've been able to get these scaly devils to bring me a good many things from the wreck. I couldn't get a ray tube. They were too wise for that. But I did get a portable radio by telling them it was my tribal god. I have it in my cell. We'll go over and you can phone your ship to come after us.
He eyed Jerry eagerly.
Let's go.
They both crawled through the gap in the wall. It was like Jerry's own, but it was piled with an assortment of junk from the wrecked spaceship. In one corner stood a compact two-way radio telephone set with its tubes still intact.
Think you can tell them how to come?
Lansing whispered. I'm not sure. They marched us along roads and the route was winding and...
I'll draw you a map,
Lansing interrupted.
You hold the light.
While Jerry held the flash, the other man spread out a piece of crumpled paper on the floor and began to draw on it with the stub of a graphite stylus. He talked as he wrote, in a shrilly excited whisper. Jerry had never liked the man in the old days, considering him excitable and undependable, and it was evident that the long captivity had not improved Walter Lansing's self-control. That did not matter. The main thing was to get out of this place. And then Jerry saw something that stiffened every muscle and made the short hair prickle all down the back of his neck. The ring finger of Lansing's left hand was missing at the second joint.
That was Part 4 of The Golden Amazons of Venus by John Murray Reynolds. From Planet Stories, Winter 1939, as found on Project Gutenberg, narrated by Julie Hoverson. Music is from Zephon, as found on Jamindo.